Ooh, borderline spirals, the worst kind of spiral. I don't know if that's true. I would, bipolar might actually be equal to. That's a hard one. Cool, psychic refugee, awesome. Well, like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. And if you like the stream, please feel free to donate. If you do so, you get a really cool noise. It's very Pavlovian. I joked about this earlier, but again, if you donate, and you can donate any amount, it gets... Where is it? This way? This way? That way. You get a Pikachu. It's good stuff. So, yeah. So, with that said, as far as borderline spirals, so I assume by that, and clarify if I'm wrong, but when you say a borderline spiral, what you mean is the way in which borderline can become self-destructive to self or the relationship based on either anxious or possibly even paranoid or dissociative behavior or thought, right? So a way in which you sort of start building off the original anxiety or the original fear of disconnection or abandonment, and then that kind of keeps spiraling out of control. And that can lead to things such as like self-fulfilling prophecies, or and what I mean by that is not like something mystical. It's not like written in some ancient manuscript, but more in the sense that, like, if we're talking about borderline people, one of the things that I know that I've been guilty of, and I know several of my clients have been guilty of in the past, is that there is a way in which if you are struggling with borderline, that is, you are struggling with this terror, this absolute existential terror, and that's what I call it a lot with my BPD clients. It's an existential terror of being alone, because when you suddenly are disconnected from them, there's this thing that happens where you suddenly, it's suddenly almost like overwhelming to the point of like fear of death. That's what it feels like when you're talking about that level of abandonment feelings. And so what I would argue is that these self-fulfilling prophecies come about when you come up with this narrative in your head and you go, well, they don't really love me and they're probably going to leave and they're probably not going to be here forever. So you get resentful, you get harmful, you start to lash out, maybe emotionally, you might have panic attacks, or you might, start talking shit. And what happens is eventually your partner gets sick of your shit, right? They get sick of seeing that stuff. And that can be really fucking hard for them. And eventually, if the partner's not aware they're dealing with mental illness, what they can do is they can bounce out of there saying, look, the relationship's not for me, I can't do this. And what ends up happening is that this reifies the belief inside the borderline person, right? They go, see, I was right. And that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. By sabotaging the relationship, you prove its fallibility. That's a really, really difficult pattern to get out of. And so one of the techniques you have to deal with here is, like, there's some for yourself and there's some for, I would say, for others. So the ones for yourself are going to be, and I know everybody hates that I'm going to bring this up like 1,000 fucking times, mindfulness, right? I know this is a fucking buzzword, and there will be a future video on the idea of corporate mindfulness and its co-opting of Buddhist techniques as a feed into capitalism. There's that topic in my brain somewhere. There's also a topic about industrial and organized psychology. Caitlin Boroshenko, or however you pronounce her name, some of her work I would be very interested to yell about. But yeah, so the long story short is that when you're talking about sort of these borderline things, yeah, funky thought, yeah, once I identified this stuff, once my therapist and I worked this stuff out, it suddenly became really clear. And then I started seeing it everywhere and realized that a lot of my clients who were like anxious and depressed, but they were really erratic, like a good 25% of them, they weren't anxious, they weren't depressed, they were borderline. They were just higher functioning borderline, and because they didn't meet the clinical bias of what people think borderline is, they got missed. And this is true in a lot of ways. Like, for example, there's actually an entire dissertation I have on my desktop right now that actually talks about the the clinical bias around borderline, that people have this very negative view in their head about borderline being this very, very toxic and manipulative type of person who's constantly erratic, constantly lashing out. And while some borderline people can be like that, that's often in cases of dual diagnosis, such as substance abuse or other trauma, right? So higher functioning BPD people, as I call them, may not show those symptoms. They might be a little bit pushy, or they might be a little bit manipulative, but again, I don't know if that's necessarily outside of the scope of what I would consider a normative relationship. And so when we're talking about dealing with these spirals, what we're talking about is this idea of watching your own thoughts and paying attention to the patterns that you notice. And so this is never a perfect art, but it is a thing that you perfect over time that's probably going to take quite some time. So to me, what you're trying to do is watch and pay attention to the framework of your thoughts and pay attention to the sensations and feelings in your body. One of the biggest notices that I can give is if you ever want to see if you're triggered, notice where you are in your body, right? Do you feel your body? Do you feel you're in your body? Or do you feel like, to some degree, your body is cut off, like you're almost stuck in your head? And I know these metaphors can be like twisted by people who want to be asses, but like there's a way that you sort of disconnect from your body because the emotion and the sensation are just so much that it's like overwhelming, right? So that kind of stuff is a big deal. And so one of the things I would say is that with mindfulness, you can pay attention to your thoughts and your feelings and notice what's actually happening. So I'll give you an example. So one of the things my Zen order identified that I actually still think is a pretty good psychological truth and feels pretty solid based on what I've researched is that the thing we primarily call anger isn't anger, it's fear. So what I mean by that is this, is that when somebody lashes out with violence, say putting their fist through the wall or screaming at somebody, what they're trying to do is control the situation, right? Either control the other person or control through intimidation or anything like that. And that's not a good thing. That's not okay. But I want to understand the context, not just judge it, right? So like, to me, what's going on in them? Well, they might feel out of control. They might feel not heard. They might feel like they have no real say in their life, whatever it might be. And those things may or may not be justified, and they probably aren't necessarily things that you should justify if the person is acting in a really, really violent fashion. But to some degree, what I want to understand is, how does that work? Because I think anger gets a bad rap in our society. And what it does, at least in my perspective, is, to me, anger is very, very controlled. Anger is something that is a response to compassion. I see something in like awful, I see something problematic, I see something that is noticeably hurtful to a group of people or a person that I care about, and I feel angry, right? If you see those old commercials on TV that says, you know, pennies a day you could be helping African orphan or whatever, like that stuff is really that stuff sucks to see. It hurts a lot, and I don't want to see a child suffer that, especially a child in a country that got screwed over by imperialism. That shit sucks, and so I get really angry about it. But I don't lash out. I don't put my fist through the wall, because it's not an issue of feeling like I need control or I need to like put that control on someone else. It's because I care. So to me, like, I tend to differentiate anger into two things. It's either clean anger or violent anger. Violent anger underneath it is just fear. Clean anger is just compassion and wanting to see something change. It's a response to injustice or unfairness, right? And so, like, when we're talking about borderline and you're using mindfulness, one of the things you're watching for is what is actually happening. Because at least in my experience, almost universally, the thing you're dealing with is fear. Is this making sense to everyone so far? Like, just a bit of feedback. Is everything so far, like, you know, working? All right, I'll keep going, but I will keep a lookout for messages. I think we have a little tiny bit of a delay. So, yeah. And by the way, just notice in the chat there is posts for Streamlabs. You can donate to the stream, and if you do so, you get a cute Pikachu right up here. And any amount is accepted. Yep, this is making sense, Psychic. Cool. Awesome. And if you want to become a patron, the Patreon link will be in the description. Cool. All right, so this is making sense to people. Awesome. Want to make sure that's the case. Cool. So, makes sense to you. Awesome, Funky Thoughts. Thank you. Real quick. Make sure everybody has all the links I want them to have. Okay, let me bring this up. I will get back to the topic in just a moment. I want to make sure you all have every bit of the links that you need, just so that I can make sure that there is not any issue. So, all right, and again, if you want to become a patron, we have 3 Patreon tiers right now. We have $5, which is you're helping out our pupper to continue feeding her insatiable hunger. We have a white bulldog mix, and she is super cute, and she likes treats. So if you want to join the $5 tier, you get that. You also get stuff early. We're probably going to make a Discord at some point. There's a couple things we're talking about doing. We have a $30 tier where my partner Zena, who will probably be uploading videos soon, is going to be doing some discussions around like intro to crafts and stuff like that. And yeah, so we might do like a craft stream like once a month kind of thing. And then I know the $50 tier is us doing a self-care stream where we have a discussion about what people are dealing with and kind of like discussing as a group like what things could be helpful. Because while I have ideas, I always like troubleshooting to the group. So if any of those sound awesome and you want to kind of watch as the channel grows, please check those out. Anyway, back to the borderline stuff. So this idea of clean and like violent anger, I think it's really important to differentiate these because as I've seen with a lot of clients, and I think I mentioned this in one of my videos, one of my clients, if I remember correctly, and a couple had this. That's true, Zena. Our pupper does indeed love carrots and bully sticks. But like one of the things that I think is super, super important is to remember that like when people are expressing anger and it's coming out as clean, and I want to be very, very clear about this. I am not talking about tone policing. Someone can be angry and still be passionate. But when I'm talking about being violent, what I'm discussing is screeching at a level beyond all kind of communication, ad hominem attacks, right? Attacking the person, attacking their characteristics, all of this stuff that kind of manifests as violence, I think is a big deal. And the reason being is that I don't think it actually serves anger. It doesn't actually get the message across, and it causes harm and damage. And the thing here is with borderline people is I think because we live in a perpetual state of anxiety, because of this tremendous fear, this terror of there's always this chance of sort of violent anger coming out, or this fear, this very primordial fear. When I'm talking to my borderline clients, one of the things I talk about is that I think that the actual thing that's happening in a lot of cases is they've got an idea, either an intrusive thought or a paranoia or a dissociativeness, something, right? And what happens is that I think they go through this stage where they start to build on that thought, resist it a bit, build on that thought, and eventually they might either, one, start getting very subservient to their partner, which is a thing I've seen, or they can start to lash out, right? And this can cause a number of effects. But what I see happening is because of the fear of them leaving, either direction is still some sort of trigger. It's still some sort of issue. Because what's happening is, if they become subservient or they start becoming overly sweet, this is almost a form of manipulation, because what they're trying to do, what I was trying to do in this form, was trying to make sure that I wasn't abandoned. Right? Does that make sense? So like, even with the positive side, it's a little bit of an extreme, because what's happening is that you're actually, to some degree, still being controlled by the fear. This is where the mindfulness comes up, and in recognizing what is the thing propelling my, what is the thing propelling my upset, right? One of the criteria of borderline is actually, unstable interpersonal relationships or incredible moments of anger, right? And I think this is what it is. You get in your head and you either lash out or you get kind of subservient and kind of caring, and when that kind of doesn't work, then you lash out anyway. And this is kind of the pattern you get stuck in, because I think that one of the things we do is when we feel out of control, that is, we feel like we're not getting the care or the love that we think we deserve, or we're afraid that our partner will someday just suddenly realize that we're not worth being with, and they're all their time with being with us is some sort of like mistake on their part that they're just going to wake up to. That fear, I think, legitimately propels us into these behaviors. And this is true with everybody, not just borderline people. I think borderline people are susceptible to it because we have a tendency to feel emotions really hard. I've had to tell some of my borderline teens before, like, listen, Babu, like, you know that knob on Spinal Tap, right? Like, if they know what Spinal Tap is, because they're fucking teenagers, right? They're usually on TikTok and shit. What they do is this really interesting thing where you kind of have to use like the amp knob thing from Spinal Tap, where you're just like, yeah, no, the knob goes to 11, because I think that kind of describes how intense the emotions are. Different people, based on, endocrinology or gender roles or their own personal makeup, are going to express emotions differently and to varying degrees and intensities. But I think with borderline people, because we're trained, and I loved this from the YouTuber Luxander, but I think this is a great description, and it's that because you learn how to ignore your emotions, you don't trust your intuition, then what happens is when the emotions come up, you don't know what the fuck to do, because your parents, if they were the ones that kind of brought this onto you, or this is a genetic thing, whatever, you never really got taught the way in which to really deal with the emotions. So you try to either stuff it or try to just lash out with it, because you don't know any coping strategy to deal with it. Right? So this is why borderline spirals are such a big deal, is because we want to first and foremost either become aware of them after the fact, which is where mindfulness can be really helpful. And ideally, with enough training in mindfulness and maybe DBT, right, dialectical behavior therapy, what we can eventually do is, through changing the dialectic of how we think about our thoughts and our feelings, and through mindfulness intervention. Because remember, DBT was a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy. I would argue it has some stuff in there from Gestalt therapy and Buddhism. Actually, there's a lot of pulling from mindfulness and Buddhism and mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? So, like, that stuff is there to interrupt that process and get good enough to the point where when you start to notice yourself getting sucked into that spiral, you pull yourself out. So that's the stuff that you can do to break the spiral, right? That's you. The second part of that is noticing when your partner, if they have borderline, is spiraling. So I'll give you a personal example from today. So my partner Zena and I have been dealing with pretty rough migraines all week. They're dealing with bodily issues because they deal with chronic illness. I deal with work stuff, so occasionally I have some really hard days. And today was a really rough one for both of us. We had some miscommunications, which led to some really kind of painful stuff. And the biggest part is that one of the things I got stuck in is this idea where I had to either put up this really hard front about something I should have just sort of apologized for, or had this idea that I had to keep pushing back and keep arguing for my own free time, my own desire to stream, and all this other stuff, when there really wasn't any argument to it. mostly just clarification of use of time. But I'd gotten in my head that my needs weren't being met, and so I started like spiraling. And I was having a hard time out of it. But Zena caught it and went, I want you to go eat. I want you to go take care of yourself, because they're fucking great. Zena's wonderful. But basically what they did is they said, go eat, go take care of yourself. So I ended up getting some like caffeine. I ended up getting some food. I ended up taking my medication. And yeah, all of a sudden I was, able to think and able to get my notes done and then able to stream to you guys. So like having a partner who understands borderline and understands those feelings and those difficulties really does, and very powerfully does, allow for you to be able to break them. Because if you can't see them in the moment, that means that to some degree you may need someone else to do it. And I know that seems potentially scary because, again, we don't ever want to oh, hi Nick, sweetheart, darling, love of my life, how are you? In the words of ContraPoints, hey, how are you, Gorge? And again, if you like the stream, please feel free to donate through Streamlabs. There's a link coming up. Just copy that into your browser and you can give me a tip. Not the tip probably some people want to give, but still, it helps. I do like getting food from my doggo. So yeah. So that's kind of the borderline thing. Is I think if you're a teenager, my argument would be is that parents need to work with you and make sure they know what spiraling looks like and learn not to take that shit personally, right? And I think if you're in a romantic relationship as adults, then I think what has to happen is I think you need to upfront inform your partner or partners that, one, you have borderline, two, this is how it works. These are the criteria you meet, because the DSM-5 stuff's right out there, right? There's 9 criteria. There's not a lot to remember. And I can even cover those at some point if people are interested. But essentially, it's let them know. In some ways, I would actually argue that talking about severe mental illness is very akin to sexual history, right? Because in some ways, what it is you're letting people know kind of what they're getting in for, right? You're talking about the stuff that, like, goes on with you. So yeah, I think this stuff is really important, and I think it's a really big deal. All right, I'm posting a link in the chat in case anyone feels like donating. All you have to do is click on that link. I figured out I was in the wrong account. I'm going to figure this stuff out eventually. Hopefully. That explains why I was not seeing the other stuff I was posting in there. Silly me. Okay. At some point, doing a borderline stream might not be a bad idea. Is that something people would be interested in? Like going actually through the criteria and discussing them. I've discussed them somewhat on my Twitter, going through like how I'm impacted by it and some of the ways that it gets stuck for me. Borderline's actually a really, really interesting discussion, and it also has a lot to do with the idea of how we sort of talk about relationships. Oh, excuse me. Especially because one of the things that's sort of a big deal is when you're talking about borderline, you're actually talking about very real fear that I think everybody has, but with borderline people, it's just accentuated. Zena said in the chat, I think a huge part of being in a relationship with anyone with mental illness is figuring out how to deal with that stuff that comes up, being able to let stuff go when needed. Yeah, I think that's really a thing. I feel like that's pretty freaking huge. Like, one of the things you're always trying to sort of gauge for or understand is like how to view their actions, the actions of your partner, right? Like, if your partner is doing this in a way that feels malicious or feels off, then I think that's a different discussion. But if this seems like mental illness flaring up and they're just really having a hard time, then I would argue that, like, no, this is a really big thing, and it may be that you have to figure out what parts are toxic and need to be discussed and what parts can just be let go of, because there's not really a maliciousness to them, if that makes sense. So yeah. Then I would argue. So, yeah. So, does anyone have any questions? Oh, hey, Funky Thoughts. I'd be interested in learning more about it. I've never been diagnosed with anything, but some of it sounds relatable. I mean, we could just do it now. Let me bring up the DSM-5 criteria. Hooray, PDFs. Oh no, it's a DSM-5 criteria stream. Alright, let's see. Apologize if my face is super bright. Okay, so we are going to go into personality disorders. So I want to be very clear before I go on. Everything talked about in this stream is going to be talked in from a general perspective, or my own experiences of mental illness. Nothing in here should in any way be a substitution for mental health work or by seeing a therapist or anything like that. The reason I say this is because I don't want anyone to confuse me as their therapist. If you are are one of my clients, cool. But if you're not, I don't want you to think that this is any way a substitute for therapy. These discussions are there to serve and to be there for other people. But I don't want in any way people to skimp out on personal work, right? So let us get started as soon as I can get down to cluster B disorders. So personality disorders are broken up into 3 clusters. Schizoid ones, for example, are in the cluster A. Avoidant personality disorder is in cluster C. That kind of gives an overview of what those are like. Cluster B has to do with 4 disorders, and they're kind of the most the most interesting. That's the best way I can put this nicely. They include antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder. So let's see if we can actually bring that window up without me screwing it up. Haha, there we go. All right, so look at that, the transition there, flawless. All right, so let's get started. So borderline personality disorder, its diagnostic criteria is code, it's 301.83. These are codes that are used in the United States to bill, essentially. Borderline is characterized by a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affect, and marked impulsivity, beginning by early adulthood and presents in a variety of contexts as indicated by 5 or more of the following. All right? And we get a drink of water and we'll get started. Yay! By the way, if you are new to the stream, please feel free to like and subscribe. I would deeply, deeply appreciate it. Ring the bell if you want to get notified when I'm doing live streams and stuff, because sometimes I'm just going to do them randomly. And yeah, if you're in the chat, you can hit the Streamlabs button to donate to the chat. Yeah, any tip is accepted. They're all really appreciated. They all go towards making this channel better. So I really appreciate it. This is something I'm doing kind of on a whim and just happen to have some of the equipment for. So I really appreciate everyone who's watching right now. It means a great deal. So with that said, now all the sappiness done, let's get started. Criteria 1. Frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Note, do not include suicidal or self-mutilating behaviors covered in Criterion 5. Good to know. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating, helps if I read words, between extremes of idealization or devaluation. Another name for this, by the way, is called splitting. And what it is when, you know, confirmation bias, where you believe a thing and then you kind of only look for evidence for that thing? Imagine that, but it goes both directions. So, for example, if you're dealing with your partner, you may think of them as wonderful, great, they're the best thing that ever happened to me. They're just so wonderful, and you just don't understand how great they are. And then the next day I'm like, they're awful, and I want to, you know, do things I can't talk about on stream to them in Minecraft. Right? Like, idealization and devaluation, I think, is a really weird phrasing, because what I tend to see it as is idealization and demonization, right? The thing is, you start to look at the other person as being the worst thing ever because they suddenly are in control of your fear, right? Because they just bounce. That sucks, and you have no control over that, and that feeling, that fear can be incredibly powerful. So splitting is a way to sort of modulate things by keeping it in black and white. And I would argue, though I haven't seen this in the literature, but this is my experience with it, as well as the experience of people who have it, splitting doesn't just happen with people. It seems to happen with ideas, ideologies, identities, parts of your personality. There's a way that you can double down on them or try to get rid of them. And this can happen really intensely, where you start interjecting, that is taking in things without critical thinking, in situations where critical thinking is necessary. So if you're really big into a particular streamer, or you really believe this particular YouTuber is great, you can kind of accidentally get sucked into that shit, and get sucked in so much that you lose that critical faculty. And well, everybody can do that through parasocial relationships. I think this happens with ideas, with all sorts of things. So if you notice a tendency to kind of, no matter how like cognitively sophisticated you are, but you still kind of like are constantly dealing with this very black and white thinking, that could be a sign of that. I'm not saying that's what you have. I am saying that could be a thing to talk to a therapist about. Again, I am not your therapist unless I am, in which case, hi. Number 3, identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. So this one's a big one. I used to jokingly call a lot of my BPD teens like my little hermit crabs, because I think there's a species of like coconut or hermit crab that like wanders the beach and like sticks garbage on its shell and just keeps wandering. I could be wrong on that. I might be remembering something from a cartoon. But the reason I think this is important to bring up here is that what I've noticed with myself is there was many years where I didn't really have so much of an identity as much as sort of like a vague hodgepodge of interests and things that sort of made an identity if I squinted at it. Right? Like, a way in which, like, things may have felt almost like they felt like an identity or a sense of self, but, like, weren't. I think that's a big deal. And I think that's something really, really important to recognize, because if you notice that you grab onto ideologies or certain thoughts or certain ways of interaction really, really intensely, it could be, right? It could be a sign that you are sort of trying to fill in these things around you to make up for the bits of self that aren't there. I know that sounds weird, but again, even as somebody who's practiced in Zen, one can make the argument that, right, Zen is by its nature about seeing through the illusion of a permanent self. And even if you have that realization, whether you believe in that or not, just for the sake of argument, let's say that's real. If it is real, that's very different than this, because this is sort of a continuous flickering as opposed to sort of a seeing through or transparency. I think that's a big deal. And so it might be something to just be aware of. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. This can include spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. Again, do not cover suicidal or self-mutilating behaviors are covered in Criterion 5. Yeah, so again, this is the one I see more with lower functioning borderline folks. It's not to say that this can't happen to other folks, but it's that Usually if somebody's dealing with dual diagnosis, that is they have a substance abuse disorder or they're dealing with some other type of disorders that complicates things like post-traumatic stress or something else, what happens is they can sort of get in these loops where they'll sort of like need to do something to make it better. A good example of this is someone who sleeps around. Not that I'm against being a slut. I'm a slut. That's fine. But the issue is not so much slutdom as it is if you just fuck a person to have that 5 seconds of somebody actually giving a shit about you or really, you know, caring about you, and the moment they come, they just get up and sort of leave. I would argue that moment where after sex is over, right, the frenetic behavior of sex that sort of overtakes you in the moment, once that's over, if all you feel is empty, and I don't mean like the sort of about like a one night stand, like that shit happens, but I mean like a sudden like just emptiness, suddenly like triggering levels of just fear and doubt about self. I would argue that would meet this criteria, because if, like, I'll give an example. I worked with a older woman, and again, I am changing some of the information to protect the innocent. I don't want to violate HIPAA. But imagine we have like an older woman who, even when she goes on business trips, even when she's interacting with certain things, she's just fucking random businessmen. And like, if that's cool in their relationship, go off. But in the case I'm sort of bringing up, I don't think it would be. In this case, this seems like more of a monogamous couple, and this seems to be a thing that like is really hidden and doesn't want to come out, because it seems to be a thing that's done compulsively. It's not that you're just really about cheating on your partner, it's that you really want that 5 minutes of sort of validation. The problem with that validation is it is not long lasting, right? And the same thing with spending or anything like that. So when you think about this, you have to think about it in regards to what is it doing. In many cases, I would argue it's a form of escapism or a way to deal with that sort of existential terror of abandonment. And this is where I think some of this comes together. My own personal theory is that criteria 1 and criteria 3 are interconnected. And that is to say that your unstable and intense your identity disturbance and your frantic efforts to avoid abandonment are connected because, as I said before, being borderline means you can take on various thoughts or ideas or ideologies, things like that. Here's what happens, I think. I think when someone who is borderline experiences the fear of losing a partner, what they inevitably fear is not just the loss of that person, but what it means to them. Because I think abandonment in the case of someone like myself or someone with, someone else who's dealing with borderline, is it's not just the fear of losing that relationship. That hurts in and of itself. But it actually also leads to the fear of them no longer mattering or being worthwhile or not existing. I know that sounds irrational, but think about it. If you've built your identity around basically the ticky tape of various different personality things you've grabbed from the internet and from others, and one of the most massive things that's influencing your actual way of thinking just leaves, like, imagine the feeling. It would be like someone ripping an organ out. It would feel like you were laying there bleeding. You'd be afraid of dying, which is where I think when we talk about frantic efforts, when we're talking about that fear of abandonment, I don't even like the term frantic efforts, and I don't like the term fear. They don't feel intense enough. I would argue this is active terror. The act of losing someone, if you're borderline, feels like dying. At least that's what it feels like to me and a lot of the clients I've worked with. So, criterion 5 is recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Again, I think this is where you're kind of half in, half out. I'll get to that in just a minute. Azul Christie. I will get to that in just a moment. So, arguably speaking, the suicidal behaviors and self-mutilating behaviors, again, I tend to see this more in lower functioning folks, but not always. Teens tend to go towards this stuff a lot. And what I would argue is that I tend to see this, especially when there's a lot of pushing against their body. They don't want to be a certain way, or they don't like their body in certain ways. I especially see some of this stuff with people who have either, one, dealt with some sort of, verbal or mental abuse. I've also seen it with some levels of sexual trauma. A few of the teens that I've interacted with have, some of them had very real sexual trauma. And the reality of the situation is that trauma kind of led to them really hating their bodies. And so when they got overly flooded with anxiety, they would cut to make that go away. In fact, I would argue a lot of cutting has to do with sort of releasing endorphins. It's why I don't try to demonize cutting when I work with people. I've gotten shit from this by other counselors and other mental health professionals. I don't have a problem with cutting. I have a problem with you cut so deeply that you have to go to the fucking hospital. I have a huge issue with cutting if there isn't some better system there. And what I would say is that if I have to choose between a kid burying their cutting and not telling me about it versus giving them tools that are a lot safer, I'll do that. So a good example of this is two of my favorites. One of the ones I learned about in CMH when working with some very, very schizoaffective people is the rubber band method. You basically just go to Office Max, you buy a fucking rubber band, one of those big thick ones, and you wear it on your wrist like a cute little fashion accessory. And what happens is that when you suddenly get the urge to cut, you grab that motherfucker, you pull it out, and you snap the living shit out of yourself. All the pain, all the endorphin release, no broken skin, no chance of infection, and no accidental cutting too deep. So if I have to choose, like, if the options are you're going to do this anyway, I'd rather you do this. And I find that really effective because you're not demonizing what the kid's doing. Their compulsion doesn't suddenly become this evil thing. Another good one that one of my colleagues came up with, and I think this one's fantastic, is you walk them into Meijer, you get some habanero salsa, the shit I eat, and what you do, actually it might be a thing. Anyway, so what I would argue is that what you do is you take like a habanero salsa or like that really, really rough ghost pepper salsa, or like the hot sauce, like the Frank stuff. Take that shit on your finger, you put a dollop on it on your tongue, and it hurts. And it does all the things necessary to bring on that sort of stuff. And guess what? No harm. Yeah, it's going to hurt because ghost peppers are fucking awful as far as their capsaicin level. The Scoville levels on those are fucking ungodly, and there are worse peppers than that. But holy shit, does it not cause the same fucking fear? It also means that the kid doesn't have to run around hiding things. I have built trust with kids in two very important ways. One, never demonizing the shit they do. I don't care about it. Not the sense I don't care about their safety, but I don't give a shit about judging them. And then two, and this one's really important. If you ever work with kids, this is like teenagers. I don't work with younger than like 13-ish. I worked with a couple 10-year-olds. They were pretty rad. Yeah, I put that shit on everything. Same here, Nick. I've been just eating habanero salsa lately just because the salt on the chips combined with the spiciness, I love it. That's why I was kind of thinking for a minute. I was like, is that me doing some sort of thing? No, I don't think it is, but fuck it. But like, this is the thing, is that the other way you can really get kids to sort of understand you, and when you're working with teens, especially if they're very closed off, is I'll do this. I'll hear out their parents' concerns, and I'll kind of do the head nod thing, right? And then what I'll do is when the parent leaves the room, I'll be like, so your mom was really fucking anxious, huh? That's fucking weird. And like, nothing will get a kid to sort of like open up in a therapy session than saying, I noticed this about your parents. I think you noticed it too. And swearing. I know that sounds really dumb, but to hear an adult to break ranks with the sort of adult behavior where everyone sort of treats them with kid gloves. Psychic refugee, absolutely. Harm reduction, and also the last dub from Hot Ones. I'll have to try that. That sounds rad. Last dab. Okay. That's the one they had, like that's the far end one, isn't it? Okay. But again, remember, people exist within social context. Teenagers are used to parents and adults talking down to them, treating them as kids. But if you treat them as an equal and you swear in front of them, they suddenly realize that you're not like above them. And you're not trying to be above them. And that's how I create alliances with kids, because in a lot of ways when I'm working with teenagers, as much as I know the parents don't like this fact, the fact of the matter is that I'm not in any way not on the kid's side. Well, yes, I have to inform parents of like overviews and tell them kind of what's going on as far as therapy, and that stuff's all great, and I want them to be happy too. My first both ethical and personal focus, my professional focus, is on making that connection with a kid. This is why I tell parents very general things, because I don't want to give up the ghost on a kid's secrets. I don't want to out a teen accidentally. I don't want to create a situation where the kid starts to see me as a mouthpiece for their parents. That shit sucks. So yeah, good way to deal with this stuff. Create systems, create techniques that allow for the same effect, but without the harm. Okay? Number 6, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood, intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, can't read today, or anxiety, usually lasting only a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. Yeah, it's emotional lability. That's the term for it. It's emotional lability. It's your emotions change very quickly and sometimes for no fucking reason. Right? Like that's what that is. Oh, thank you, Psychic Refugee. Yep, the hottest one. I might have to check that one out. I'm very picky about very, very spicy sauces, not because I don't like the spice, but sometimes they taste. Sometimes we sacrifice spice for taste, and I hate that shit. I don't mind burning the fuck out of my mouth as long as it's like tastes good. Like my favorite salsa is like, just go to like, I don't know where you're from, but like for me we have like Meyer, or as Joe Biden calls it, Myers, which is the appropriate way to call it. Gonna get yelled at for that one. But yeah, so like if you go to any like grocery store, many of them have a brand called Mrs. Renfro's, and like I know it seems weird to be like propping up like a grocery store salsa, but their habanero is so fucking tasty. I'm probably gonna eat more of it before I go to bed. I go through this stuff like whoa. I would actually say a huge amount of the weight I've put on for transitioning, probably from salsa. Houston, Texas over here. Oh, so you have good access to stuff. Also, I hope you're okay. Holy shit. Holy shit. Please tell. Luckily, this is designed to keep the flavor along with the spice. Oh, it is? It's good? Okay. Will someone post the link for it in chat? I would fucking love to get some more good salsa and good hot sauce. That would be rad. I will totally take suggestions. So while we're doing that, I'll wait for someone to get a link. I will continue on. Number 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. I think this is a really big deal. So there is a way in which, like, as I said before, if your sense of good, Psychic Refugee, I'm glad. I saw Texas and I immediately like panicked. I've had power since Thursday. Awesome. Okay, good. I'm so glad you're okay. Please be okay. Use of the last few iotas of power to watch my stream. That would be rough. But yeah, someone can get that Hot Ones, the final dip or dab link in chat. That'd be rad. Because I will buy that shit off the internet tonight. But chronic feelings of emptiness, I feel like this goes along with the unstable sense of self. Like, again, if your sense of self is built up on what your personality traits are based on parents, friends, background, things like that, and you don't really have like a core feeling or experience of sense of self, then I feel like what you end up getting into... Got it, Psychic Refugee. Thank you. At least you're okay. That's all I can hope for. By the way, if you like the stream, please feel free to like this video. Feel free to like any of the videos that come out after it. And please consider subscribing. Oh, I was lifted today, so I'm back to full civilization. Wonderful. I'm so glad you're safe. That's so fucking great. Yeah, if people in the chat that are listening want to post hearts because we're also glad the Psychic Refugee's okay, please do so. I would appreciate it. Let's see. So yeah, so the chronic feelings of emptiness, I feel like, thank you, Zena. You're the best. I love you. Yeah, rock on. Cool. So yeah, again, my sense is, I don't care if it's not like the bomb, I still want to try it. I'm not like looking for like the perfect hot sauce. I just want tastiness, right? Like, I just want to burn the shit out of my mouth and have enough salt that like the spiralactone god is appeased, right? What was that one thing I saw? There was that fucking meme where it was like one of the countries used like pickle juice on their highways to melt the ice, and like they were like, oh, now all these trans girls are going out there and like licking the fucking pavement, and it's like, well, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting there. I've never had to put more salt on my fucking toast in my life. Jesus Christ. Anyway, back to mental health and not my HRT stories. So like, again, if your sense of self or your identity is based around sort of these very ephemeral aspects that don't feel core to you, they don't feel right, then Psychic Refugees knows what's up. Dab is seasonal, last I checked. Damn it, Elizabeth. Ah, you're killing me. I love you still, but you're killing me. I'll have to look it up. The last dab. Zena just calling me the fuck out. Like, hey, love, we're having this discussion. Can I go get salsa while I do it? I just ate chicken nuggets with, like, spicy mustard and fucking sriracha. Like, Oh, no. If anyone here's on, like, 200 milligrams of spiralactone, they know what's up. Like, I can't imagine. I can't fucking imagine that being another thing. Anyway. So again, if your sense of self is kind of like wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey, emptiness is going to be a thing. There might be moments where you just don't feel like you're anyone, and that could be really rough. Next we have inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger, frequent displays of temper, constant anger, yep, recurrent fights. Nick, if you ever do HRT, my friend, you will know the power of salt. Holy shit. It's like it's like old Chappelle show levels of salt. Like that's how salty that shit is. Again, incredible anger, lashing out. Again, I would argue market based on fear. I would say intense or difficult to control anger is again a response of fear, which makes sense with the rest of the diagnosis, right? Last but not least, transient stress-related paranoid ideations or severe dissociative symptoms. Sarah Luna, man, can it just be a thing? And like, if this channel ever gets big enough and we like have a community, can we like just have a hot sauce club? Like, I just want like a hot sauce salsa club. I would really love that. Like, holy shit. I'm not even joking. Like, I take Mediterranean sea salt and crunch that shit onto my toast. Like, Zena gets the no salt butter because that's like better and stuff, and I just put fucking gobs of salt on. You're on Spyro, so I feel like I left out. You are left out. Funky thought you were left out on the Spyro, on the salt cravings. It's unreal. You're not missing anything, and you're missing everything. I don't know how to tell it the other way. So coming back to this stuff. So the one thing I want to make very clear is that when we're talking about these sort of transient stress-related paranoid ideations, yes, I want in the hot sauce club. Okay. Someone needs to workshop this. Our community needs to be named after this. I don't know if Hot Sauce Club works. I think we need to shop that around, but like, I'm serious. I will totally be down for calling my community spicy in some particular way. I just workshop that shit. I'm bad at this thing. Yes, that's true, Zena. I get to... Zena knows, like, we have to make a lot of, like, non-cow dairy stuff, so, like, a lot of times it's, like, sort of using the magic and trickery to bomb taste like asphalt to me. That's fair. That's super fair. There are some that are... like, Frank's Red Hot I can't do, because it has a really weird aftertaste. Zena's like, I need this as bland as possible, and I'm just like, nope. Yeah, definitely better name. Like, I'm just saying Hot Sauce Club is good. I want to workshop it, but I think that'd be fucking cool. I really think that would be fucking cool, guys. Anyway, back to this thing. So, the point I'm making with borderline is this, is that I can't tell you if you have it or not. You're not my client, and I wouldn't be able to do that if you were my client, because I couldn't say that on fucking stream. But I do think it's super important to look at this stuff and go, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean to me? If I notice these things in me, this kind of constantly on the edge of anxiety and fear and all that, I think this is the thing to talk to your therapist about. And I'm not saying like this means you have borderline if you identify with some of this stuff, but I want to be really clear that I feel like this is a thing. Psycho Refugee knows what's up. Spiralactone. But I really do think this is a thing. And I want to just be really super clear about it. I want to make sure people are aware of the fact that, like, this disorder does not mean you're the worst person in the world. It doesn't mean that clinicians should avoid you or go with what older clinicians said, because there's some really fucked up shit around borderline. Give you an example. I have seen older clients, usually women, usually in their 40s or 50s, who were originally diagnosed with borderline in the 90s. And do you know what happened? Essentially, they were told that they had to be molested. This had to have happened to them. This had to be in their past, because back then, the misunderstanding is that being BPD always came with trauma. Always. And so what happened is they would literally browbeat and like legitimately and completely, try to bully these people into thinking that they had this. And these are people that were like in their teens or 20s. Like, borderline has a ton of stuff around it. If I ever do a research doc, which I might do, one of the things that's going to be on there is the dissertation I have talking about this bias, because it's fucking real and it's awful. Borderline people are not inherently dangerous or obsessive or anything like that. They can be in dual diagnosis situations or when there's severe trauma involved, but not all of them have that. In fact, trauma doesn't make up even 50% of it. It's probably like closer to, if I remember correctly, it's like 30, 40. I know heritability is 40%. I don't remember the numbers on trauma at the moment. But yeah, this is the thing I deal with. And I don't deal with all of these. I don't really show any signs of self-harm unless you want to talk about my obsession with salsa to be a thing. Emotional instability tends to be more based on stress-related. Stress-related paranoia and severe dissociative symptoms. Oh. Yeah, those can definitely happen. Like, I can't front on that. Zena's a fucking awesome human being, so... But yeah, so that is borderline. And I want people to be aware of the fact that, like, just because you identify with this stuff, that doesn't mean it's all bad. When I found out I had borderline, it actually started from a conversation of wondering if I had bipolar. And when I was talking to my therapist, what ended up happening is me sort of realizing or coming to the realization of, essentially coming to the realization of that, like, as much as people were sort of demonizing this disorder, I wasn't particularly bothered by it because it gave me a name to the beast. This thing that had hounded me, this incredible overreaction, this incredible just intensity. Basically, in no short part, I had a name for all those feelings I had as a teenager. Now, granted, I didn't get all the names because there was the gender dysphoria, but you know what I mean. So this is borderline. So if this is something that's interesting to people, we can talk more about these, and we can also go over other diagnoses and other disorders. I'm cool talking about this stuff in a very general sense. Obviously, I don't want to, if I ever get on like Discord with anybody or want to talk to any of you guys, I don't want it to ever seem like this is something I'm diagnosing you with or anything. I don't mind giving sort of my general thoughts on a particular situation, but again, I'm not doing therapy. And I know it sounds like I'm overly saying this, but to say that I'm a licensed counselor on stream means I have to be held to a certain standard of behavior. And while I can be lolzy and I can be silly, And the Beast had memes. That's true love. So yeah. So yeah, I think that's good for Borderlands.